Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go.
Amateur Traveler, episode 124. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Nicaragua with the author of The Moon Handbook, Nicaragua. Learn about the land of lakes and volcanoes, beautiful colonial towns, baseball, and why you might want to be careful water skiing in Nicaragua. All this and more on this episode of The Amateur Traveler. Welcome to The Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into the interview, I have a couple announcements and news stories for you today. The first news story I have for you comes from United Airlines, and it's bad news for those of you who are traveling on United and not packing light. As of May 5th, United will start charging $25 for a second bag. So if you pack one bag, no charge. Second bag, $25 if you're flying domestically within the United States. So this is yet another fee on the path to pay toilets on airplanes. The second news story I have for you is sort of an anti-news story. There have been reports on various travel blogs about a Boeing 797 wide-body airliner that was under construction. And when I say wide body, according to the reports, this is actually a blended wing design that would seat 1,000 passengers and looks something like a large version of the Bat plane. It's very cool pictures. It's incredibly interesting aircraft, and unfortunately, it's also not true according to Boeing. So if you have read about that, don't be passing that story on to your friends, as I did, until you find out a little more. And I'll have links to both those stories on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Coming soon to amateurtraveler.com, I'm hoping sometime this week, I'm planning on replacing the current travel links directory with a new travel wiki. Anybody who's interested in helping edit the travel wiki, everyone will be able to do that once it's announced. If you want to get early access, just drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. I would like to welcome to the show Joshua Berman, who has come to talk to us about Nicaragua. Joshua is the author of both The Moon Nicaragua guidebook as well as Living Abroad in Nicaragua, which is a guide for expats. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
What led you to start writing about Nicaragua? What's the connection to Nicaragua?
The connection was back in 1997, I sent in an application to the U.S. Peace Corps, and they assigned me to Nicaragua. I took some Spanish classes, and I went down there and was there for 2.5 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, which included some intensive language training and just a great experience with the country. And there was no guidebook there. So my friend Randy Wood and I, who were in the same training group, and we were editors of the Peace Corps magazine together, just decided that we would write the guidebook that we wished we had when we got there.
Interesting.
We did that for Moon, for Avalon Travel Publishing, and that's given us an excuse to keep coming back to the country.
And you say you just put the third edition, you just sent that off to the publisher, so you've already got 2 editions on the shelf and then the third one coming in the fall, I understand.
That's correct. I just sent the manuscript in last Friday with all of the new updates in Nicaragua.
So perfect timing for us to talk to you. Everybody who's listening gets a 6 months head start on what you're going to find out in the next guidebook here. So thank you very much for sharing with us. Where were you in Nicaragua when you were first there with the Peace Corps?
My training town was called Pio 12, which is in the Pueblos Blancos, which is a great destination right between Managua and Granada. So that was 3 months in a town called Pio 12. And then I was sent for 2 years to the town of La Trinidad, which is a small town on the highway to Estelí in the north of the country. So I was in the northern mountains for those 2 years.
And so I assume Los Pueblos Blancos, like in Andalusia in southern Spain, are white hill towns?
Correct, yeah. They name it after the pure white paint of the churches. And each town has a different church, and each town has a different craft or skill or legend about it that makes it distinct from the other towns. There's about a dozen of the towns scattered in these hills south of Managua.
When you say different craft or skill or legends, for instance,
there's a town called Mazatepe, which is they're famous for the wood furniture that they make and some of the wicker work and the bamboo baskets, and you'll see those at shops all along the road. And then at Catarina and Diriamba are famous for their viveros, or their tree nurseries and plant nurseries. So people go there to buy ornamental plants from all over the country.
Oh, interesting.
Another town, Niquinomo, is where Sandino was born, and it's also known for its black magic or its supposed witchcraft that people practice there.
Okay. Nicaragua, you've been writing guidebooks here for a while. Why should someone go to Nicaragua?
The typical spin that it's been getting in the press lately, and it's been getting a lot of press.
It's the new Costa Rica.
Exactly. And there's, in a sense, that's where people are deciding to go now. I suppose you could say that. But otherwise, it's a pretty misleading statement just because of how distinct the countries are. There's quite a bit of hype, especially down in the southwest of the country. So people would go there where the tourism industry isn't quite as developed as it is in somewhere like Costa Rica or more visited parts of Mexico, say. Except for a couple of very, very small focused areas in Nicaragua where most of the tourism is happening, you can very well still be the only gringo in town if you go off the beaten path, which is very, very easy to do in Nicaragua.
What is the beaten path, first of all, and then let's go off the beaten path a bit and talk about things to see off there. So if we go where the other tourists are going, where are we going? We're going to Managua, I assume?
Most people manage to figure out a way to skip Managua, actually.
Oh, okay.
Managua's a big, flat, sprawling city. Used to be the most cosmopolitan of Central America cities until it was flattened in an earthquake in 1972. Okay. And never really recovered until the last few years. There's been a lot of investment. So it's a fun place, but it's not the prettiest. It's a very distinct city. There's volcano craters coming up right in the middle of the city. It's got some interesting history, but the Gringo Trail is, for the most part, people go straight from the airport to Granada, which is only an hour away. And they base their time in Granada and San Juan del Sur, which is a beach town on the Pacific coast. That's the standard thing, especially if people have limited time, and it's a great trip to do. I was just in Granada last month. It's a beautiful, beautiful, classic colonial town right on the lake, right on one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And then San Juan del Sur is this Pacific coast surf town that was maybe one of the first places that foreign backpackers kind of started when they started peeking over from Costa Rica, the surfers.
Okay. And then what is your recommendation for, okay, that's the Gringo Trail. When you get people and they start reading your guidebook, you recommend they go where? Say we had a week or 2 weeks in Nicaragua. How would you spend it?
There's definitely many ways that you can spend that time, and you certainly won't be bored. I definitely always recommend still another kind of a third point, if this was going to be on that Gringo Trail, would be the Isla de Ometepe, which is the double volcanic island right in the middle of Lake Nicaragua, which is also called Lake Cocibolca, or the Sweet Sea. It's a really incredible, kind of mysterious feeling place. One of the volcanoes is active, one is dormant. You could hike to the top of both of them. There are all these legends that kind of surround the island. There's petroglyphs, there's kayaking, and some really unique places to stay there, especially if you're really into kind of a more rural tourism. There's a couple of working farms there that have youth hostels on them. So really a magical place to stay.
And what kind of farms in Nicaragua? Is this coffee?
One of them is a coffee farm. That's La Finca Magdalena. And actually the cover of the current edition of the book is taken from the front porch of Finca Magdalena.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And this was a leftover coffee cooperative that was formed during the Sandinista years, during the 80s. And a few of these cooperatives have survived. Well, a handful of them are making an attempt at ecotourism, or cafe turismo, where you can go and stay on these coffee farms. And then there's some kind of permaculture experiments on Ometepe where they're growing all kinds of gardens, organic vegetables. And the bigger farms there, they grow bananas and sorghum and sesame and corn, as always.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the Sandinista years, and we probably ought to do just a little bit of history here about Nicaragua. Certainly for many Americans who have heard of Nicaragua, they've heard about it through our, I was going to say relationship or lack of relationship with the government at that time period, the Sandinista years, which was is it correct to say a communist government or a socialist government? I'm not sure which is more accurate.
Yeah, they definitely, by the time they took power, they were reading some of the Marxist handbooks, but definitely doing their own version of it. And yeah, a lot of the land reform and nationalization of businesses that usually did not go so well. And then, of course, having war waged on them secretly by the CIA and then these Contra forces, these people who were not satisfied with what they were doing. But yeah, in the big picture of things, the U.S. has been involved in Nicaragua's affairs for over 150 years, mainly because it's a very critical point for crossing the isthmus. It was where they almost built Panama Canal.
Right. Although I suspect we would have called it something else if it had been built in Nicaragua. But
I think so. And the classic story there is that back in the 1860s or so, they were proposing to build the canal because the Rio San Juan goes from the Caribbean all the way up into Lake Cocibolca, and then it's only a very short trip right across to the Pacific. So that became a route that people did first during the gold rush. Cornelius Vanderbilt had a shipping line that sent people along that route. Mark Twain made that trip. And then they were going to dig a canal through there. The story is that there was a big volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. I think it was Krakatoa.
Oh, okay.
And sometime after that, a U.S. congressman took a postage stamp of Nicaragua with volcanoes on it and presented it in the U.S. Congress and said, this is where you want to build your canal. So they changed the plans and moved south to Panama.
And when you say a big volcanic eruption, that was the volcanic eruption that the following year there was no summer. That basically most of the northern hemisphere. So I could imagine that would affect their perceptions at that point.
And speaking of volcanoes, we really kind of, it's another place we could have started with Nicaragua. It is known as the land of lakes and volcanoes. There are, depending on what you count as a volcano, there's about 40 volcanoes, and they run southeast to north and west along the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. They're part of the whole ring of fire that goes circles the Pacific. About 6 of those are active and occasionally erupt. So that keeps things interesting. And you can climb up to the top of all of them and look into the craters. And sometimes you see lava. Sometimes you just see sulfur vents. Sometimes dormant ones, they're carpeted with cloud forests and monkeys. And that's another big reason that people would go to Nicaragua is to do, we call it volcano hopping, and just go and see how many they can hike. And there's really good quality guides that you can hire in most of the places to get to the top.
Okay. And then you said, for instance, the new Costa Rica. Partially, when people say that, they're talking about ecotourism. And I assume that hiking the mountains and seeing the monkeys is part of that. What are the highlights for ecotourism in Nicaragua?
For me, one of the best examples and opportunities of ecotourism, and when I talk about ecotourism, I more tend to think of it as this idea of sustainable tourism or community tourism, something that does involve the outdoors, but also is run by these community-based organizations,
right?
Like these coffee cooperatives. And so for me, one of my favorite places is up in Matagalpa in the north of Nicaragua, which is the heart of coffee country. It's got a little more altitude up there. The hills are much steeper. And they grow a lot of shade coffee up there. So there's a canopy of cloud forest that covers the coffee plants, which making these just amazing places to visit. And at several cooperatives and several eco-lodges in the coffee hills of different budget levels, too. You could stay either in a cabin or you can stay with an actual family, a cafetalero family, and wake up at 5 in the morning and pick coffee and learn how to mill it and depulp it and everything else about the life of the people that pick our coffee.
Interesting. What is the expense for that? I know that sometimes, even though you're providing labor, there is some cost to that. How expensive is that sort of stay?
The cheapest ones are the really kind of primitive accommodations where you really are staying in the homes, staying in kind of these little shacks up on the hillsides of some of the poorest but kind of more stablest of Nicaragua's farmers. And those, I think they're running somewhere between $20 and $30 a day, which includes 3 meals and a bed, and usually includes some form of guided activity, like hiking to a waterfall or hiking to some local natural attraction. And then if you stay at, let's say, Selva Negra, which is an older, more upscale eco-lodge in the same Matagalpa Hills that's been around for a long time, where it's kind of these stone cottages that you stay in. It is a working coffee farm as well. I think it's up to maybe $40, $50, $60 a night, depending on the accommodations.
Still not that much, though, okay.
Yeah, still very reasonable. And that's another one of the big reasons overall to visit Nicaragua. It really is cheap for Central America. The upscale market is just starting to take hold in Nicaragua, and there's some wonderful places you can stay. But still, the most money you can possibly spend on a night is maybe $300 a night at the Morgan's Rock Hacienda, which is, if you've seen any of the luxury tourism that's going up in Costa Rica and Belize and other places where they're charging over $1,000 a night.
Oh, good.
It's kind of a whole other level. It still definitely does not exist yet in Nicaragua.
Okay. 2-part question. When you first went to the country, what was the biggest surprise for you?
It's a good question. When I first went there and I was wrapped up in trying to learn the language, that was such an uphill struggle that really kind of consumed everything. And then once I started to kind of get a hold of the language, then after 3, 4, 5 months and really started to be able to communicate with people on deeper levels than just greeting them, then I think I was surprised, by just the depth of understanding that I could keep having about this place and living with people who were on both sides of supporting the Sandinistas and against the Sandinistas, and just really learning about these recent folds of history there. I guess another thing is the Nicaraguans, they really, really are proud to be Nicaraguans and not Hondurans or Costa Ricans. If I was going to compare them to other countries, they're very lively people. They speak their opinion. Even leading up to the revolution and during the Sandinismo, they always have had pretty good freedom of speech and press, and that's something that you feel a little bit different in places like Guatemala or El Salvador, where there really were death squads going out in the 1980s, that violence, which has ended, by the way, at the end of the 1980s. So there's something about that. I think it's this kind of fierce independence to the Nicaraguans that makes them very fun to be around, the way that they live life, celebrating life every day, dancing and singing. And that was something that I never really expected. I never really thought to expect. But it's one of the reasons I keep going back, because I have some very, very close friends there that I think developed because of sharing all of that celebration.
Okay. And the most recent trip that you've had back to Nicaragua, what was the biggest surprise?
How many new hotels there are in Granada.
Okay.
It's pretty wild. It was expected because the last year and a half or so, Nicaragua's been in the travel section of the New York Times 2 or 3 times and every other major newspaper. It's always the same story. Nicaragua is no longer this Cold War battleground, and it's taken 28 years for people to realize that, but they have realized it. And the initial impact of that is definitely in Granada. And some of these places really, really are nice. The classic kind of converted colonial home surrounding an open courtyard that's really lush and green, that is in open air. And some of them have done a really, really good job. You can spend $50-$60 a night and be in a really nice, large, old colonial home.
Interesting.
The couple of hotels that do the top level upscale in Granada are still less than $150 a night.
Okay, so that was mostly the essay portion of our quiz here. Now the fill in the blank.
Okay.
So if you had to complete the sentence, you haven't really seen Nicaragua until you've seen what?
Granada definitely belongs to the top of the list.
Okay.
It's just so colorful and it's so bright and just a great way to ease into the country. But then if I was going to say something that wasn't quite as obvious, I think Ometepe belongs on that list too. There's nowhere like that anywhere else that I've ever seen in any of my travels. Being able to take a boat out to this volcanic island and stay on the slopes of the volcano is pretty wild.
Okay. You haven't really experienced Nicaragua until you've eaten what?
Until you've eaten a fritanga, which is the that's the street grill, basically.
Okay.
I think we call it the backyard barbecue meets the deep fryer because there's a lot of grease, a lot of fried stuff, and then a lot of roasted meat over the flames.
So that's not a particular dish, more of a type of restaurant or street stall.
Yeah, 9 out of 10 times you get a plate with gallo pinto, which is the rice and beans, Nicaraguan version of rice and beans. So that's probably the most basic staple Nicaraguan food.
Sure.
Is gallo pinto. Usually next to that, some form of platano, of plantain, and a piece of meat or some cabbage as salad.
Okay. Before you leave Nicaragua, you should really do what?
You should really, you should really go to a baseball game.
Oh, okay.
If you're lucky, if you're there during the season.
Good choice, okay.
If you're there during the season and you can catch a baseball game, it's quite an experience. It costs about 50 cents to get in the ballpark. Nicaraguans are crazy about baseball. Way, way, way more than soccer, sorry. And they're pretty much the only country in Central America where it's like that. Part of that might be the Cuban influence. Part of it might be that U.S. Marines were stationed.
I usually blame it on the U.S. Marines.
Yeah, and that was in the very beginning of the 20th century. The Marines spent several decades occupying Nicaragua. So I think that had something to do with it.
Collecting debts, as I recall.
So yeah, I got to go to a game in Masaya last month when I was there, and I watched San Fernando, is the name of the Masaya team, play the team from León, which is the other colonial town a little bit to the northwest.
Excellent. I've had some friends who've gone to the baseball games in Mexico, and same thing, crazy about baseball.
It's so cool to see, the different foods that they hawk there. And
yeah, I suppose you don't get a hot dog at a baseball game. What do you get at a Nicaragua baseball game?
They do have hot dogs.
They do have hot dogs.
And they do have pizza. Although in the hot dogs, they usually pile it up with mayonnaise, ketchup, cabbage, chile. It's pretty gross. But they also have a vigarón, which is the fried, boiled yuca with pork rinds, and it's served on a banana leaf. They serve quesillo, which is another very classic Nicaraguan food. It's kind of like a homemade mozzarella string cheese in a tortilla, and then drowned in a spicy vinegar chili sauce, and with sour cream on there too. And it's served in a plastic bag, and you get that at the ballpark. And then plenty of beer, plenty of cerveza, the Toña and Victoria. They got people walking around selling you bottles. So there's a lot that's kind of like going to a game in the U.S., but then it's just so much more relaxed, and it's a lot less hype and a lot less advertisements that you're being bombarded with. And it's a nice outing in Nicaragua. It's definitely not the experience that you expect.
One thing we didn't talk about is, how are we getting around in Nicaragua? Are we just taking the buses? Do you recommend renting a car? What's the best way to get around?
If you have the time, I recommend taking the public transportation. And then even between the main tourist points, now there's a lot of shuttle services that the tour operators and hostels are doing. So that makes it really easy. You'll pay $15 to get from Granada to San Juan del Sur or to León instead of maybe $4 or $5 if you take the buses. And our books explain in detail where to catch the bus, and it's very easy to find out too.
And when we say the bus, I assume we're talking about a public bus, and it's probably very regular, but it's the chicken bus?
We're talking everything from what they call interlocales or microbuses, which are basically minivans, express minivans that go between the main cities. Those are usually the best way to get around. But if you're going into the north of the country, or into the interior, then yes, you'll be on the converted, North American yellow school buses,
yeah.
which are now chicken buses because, they're usually crowded and someone's got a live chicken hanging in your face.
As you researched for this version of the guidebook, what are you most excited about that's changing in the third version?
One is just giving readers a really good updated slice of what's going on in Granada and San Juan del Sur. And one of those things, like I mentioned, all the new colonial hotels is great. And then the other thing is up and down the coast, there's all these new surf camps and eco lodges on the beach that range anywhere from really primitive, no electricity, but really well done and clean surf cabanas at Los Cardones Eco Lodge, which is just west of Managua, to some more luxurious ones, to renting whole houses where some of the real estate development's going up in the Southwest. So that's something that's kind of big, and they really do cater to the surfers and give lessons, and a lot of the surf is for more experienced surfers. You can get pretty big on the Pacific side there.
Okay. One moment that you thought, I could only be in Nicaragua?
For me, I think, on this last trip, I had that moment when a friend actually took me water skiing on Lake Nicaragua near the Isletas, near Granada. And I'm sitting there water skiing, looking up one side, and there's a big volcano, Volcan Mombacho, and on the other side are these little islands. And then there's always the knowledge that the only freshwater sharks in the world are in this lake. They're mostly dead. They're mostly dead. Somoza, the dictator, slaughtered tens of thousands of them before he was out of powder for the shark fin soup. But there's still, every now and then, there's a sighting there. I would say that could only happen in Nicaragua.
And you say this is a friend that took you water skiing with the sharks.
Yeah.
Any last recommendations for people if they're going to Nicaragua? Last bit of wisdom that you'd like to leave with them?
I guess it's to do at least one trip, even if it's a day trip, but ideally more into the north of the country to get off that beaten path of Granada and San Juan del Sur, which, like I said, are amazing destinations. There's a reason that they're very popular.
Uh-huh.
Go up to just any random village in the north. That's another thing. We call it pueblo hopping. Just go off the Pan American Highway, pick a village, stay in the, there's one of 3 little guest houses there, and stay there and just kind of soak in that pueblo life. I definitely encourage people to do that. That's one of the really nicest ways to just soak in Nicaragua.
Actually, the one thing we haven't talked about is your other book, The Living Abroad in Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. So you've got this second guidebook about moving to Nicaragua. We don't have a lot more time left. What would you say about that opportunity? Why are people moving down there, and what's special about being an expat in Nicaragua?
Being an expat anywhere is an amazing experience, and that's something that I think everybody should get to experience, having that perspective on America from outside America. In Nicaragua in particular, a lot of it is there are these people moving there. There are everywhere from baby boomers retiring to surfers setting up camp, people staying there for months at a time to do volunteer work or to go to Spanish school, and people staying for years at a time to invest in property or to try to be a coffee farmer. Most of the gringos are living in Granada and the hills around San Juan del Sur. And our book kind of breaks it down about all the hoops you got to jump through to get a visa, to ship a container, or to get a vehicle down there, the ins and outs of buying property, just what to look for in the construction. My co-author, Randy, is an engineer, and he's married to a Nicaraguan, so he's got his specialties. I always keep track of all the different organizations that offer volunteer opportunities, and then all of the new Spanish schools. And learning Spanish, by the way, is another big reason that people come to Nicaragua.
Sure.
In that sense, it's kind of like the new Guatemala, where there's these Spanish schools all over the country, where for between $150, $200 a week, you can get 4 hours of Spanish instruction a day, sometimes one-on-one, plus 3 meals, a homestay with a local family, and some chances to go on some trips and do some volunteer work. That's a great way to spend a couple weeks or even a couple months in Nicaragua.
Interesting. Well, I thank you so much for being on our show. Our guest again is Joshua Berman, who is the author of The Moon Guide to Nicaragua, as well as Living Abroad in Nicaragua. And you also have a website. You want to tell us a little bit about where that is?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My co-author and I run a website that is gotonicaragua.com. That's GOTO, Nicaragua.com. And it's kind of the unofficial site for learning more about our books, where we blog a little bit about news items. And we have our Nicaragua travel planner. You can see excerpts from the book. But the main thing, too, is we have a user forum there where readers post questions and we both of us answer the questions. And if there's any updates to the book, it's kind of a way just to keep things as up to date as we can with the books. So we really welcome people to come sign up on the forum and ask any questions you have about planning your trip to Nicaragua or tell us stories about your time there.
And we'll put links to both the books as well as to go to Nicaragua in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Thank you so much for being on the show and talking to us about Nicaragua.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
I have one internet resource for you today. For those of you who listen to the show, you may remember that last month we had Harry Pariser on the show talking about yet another Central American country, which was Costa Rica. And Harry let me know that he has a free PDF update to the book on his website. And the update has some new hotels and restaurants that opened just in the last year, as well as recent events, including increased fees in some of the parks. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. And in news from the community this week, reaching way down into the mailbag and finding some email that I didn't share, but I got it quite a few months ago. I got a letter from Marin that says, "Thanks for your podcast. I discovered your site about 6 months ago." I don't want to say how many months ago it is now, and have still not caught up with the backlog of episodes. I love to sit or stand on the train during the morning commute and scroll through the list to see which country I'd most like to visit for the next 30 minutes or so. Or sometimes I just press play and let you take me on a mystery journey. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and so tend to travel to Southeast Asia more than Europe or the US, but there's not a continent that is not on my to-do list. In January 2006, my boyfriend and I spent 3 weeks in Southwest India, and I was so impressed by what I saw and experienced that I felt I had to keep writing home to tell about it. I could not stop the voice in my head from narrating everything I did as if I were telling the story. So I keep a notebook and emailed home whenever I could. My family and friends commented on how much they enjoyed the installments. I've attached them for you. I've asked Marin whether she'd be willing to share these on the discussion boards. So I was very surprised to find that on a more recent trip to Europe, I didn't get the same urges. I did a little bit of writing, but the emails home were more like, "Hi, Mom and Dad, I'm still alive." I wonder what motivated me in India. There was a negative aspect to all that was emailing too, and I don't mean the hour spent in internet cafes. It was that when I returned home, everyone had already heard about the trip. There were no excuses to spend hours by the water fountain at work reliving the holiday one more time. But then, of course, there are the photos. Marin, I should warn you that the urge to narrate everything you see can lead you on the road to being a podcaster, and that can chew up just great amounts of time. So I should give you that warning that be careful. And with that, we'll bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them at amateurtraveler.com. Be sure to check out the other travel blog I write at tripinator.com. And send me any emails at host@amateurtraveler.com. And oh, wait, there is a new way to contact me. If you go to amateurtraveler.com/contact and click the button there and enter in your phone number, assuming that it is a domestic U.S. phone number, I think, it will actually dial you back and you can leave a voicemail for free. And this is using a new service called Grand Central. So that does mean I've also changed the main comment number at the same time as I switched to this service. So heads up about that. And drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.